The grocery store was quiet, save for the hum of overhead lights and the occasional squeak of a cart's wheels. Lydia wandered the aisles, her list in one hand, her thoughts elsewhere. This weekly trip had become more than a chore. It was a routine that kept her grounded. At 53, life had settled into predictable patterns, each day mirroring the one before. She paused in front of the canned goods, scanning the shelves with a practiced eye. As she reached for a jar of marinara sauce, her fingers brushed against someone else's. "Sorry," a voice said, warm and rich with laughter. She turned to find a man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, with a broad smile and kind, hazel eyes. "It's fine," Lydia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He gestured toward the shelf. "You go ahead. I'm not in a rush." She grabbed her jar and stepped aside, noticing the easy confidence in his movements as he picked up a jar for himself. "Do you always go for this brand?" he asked, holding up the sauce. Surprised, Lydia nodded. "It's reliable. Not too sweet. Good to know." He smiled again, and she couldn't help but return it. The moment passed quickly, but as she moved on to the produce section, she found herself glancing back. He was there again, examining a bundle of basil as if it held secrets. "Planning a feast?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked up amused. "Something like that. I'm trying to replicate my grandmother's lasagna, but I think I'm in over my head." Their conversation stretched from basil to the best kinds of cheese, and by the time they reached the checkout line, Lydia felt a spark she hadn't experienced in years. He introduced himself as Ben, and before they parted ways he thanked her for the tips, calling her a lifesaver. Driving home, Lydia replayed their exchange in her mind. It had been such a small thing. Two strangers crossing paths in the mundane setting of a grocery store. Yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, her day had been anything but ordinary. The next week, Lydia found herself lingering in the same aisle, her heart fluttering with an unfamiliar anticipation. She told herself it was silly. Ben was a stranger, a fleeting moment in her routine. Yet, as she reached for another jar of marinara sauce, a familiar voice broke her thoughts. "Back for your reliable sauce?" She turned, startled but pleased to see Ben standing a few feet away, holding a basket laden with fresh ingredients. "I guess I am," she replied, smiling. "How did your lasagna turn out?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Not as great as I hoped. I think I overcooked the noodles. But I'm determined to try again. Any tips?" It was easy to fall into conversation, the kind that felt natural despite their difference in age. They talked about recipes, family traditions, and how both found solace in cooking. Ben had a way of listening that made her feel seen, a warmth in his gaze that was both comforting and disarming. By the time Lydia reached the checkout, Ben was there too, placing his items on the conveyor belt. As they walked to their cars, he said, "You know, I might need a mentor for this cooking journey. Any chance you'd want to grab coffee sometime? I could use all the help I can get." Her heart skipped. She hesitated, unsure of what to say. She hadn't been asked out, or even approached in this way in years. Yet, Ben's tone was casual, his smile genuine. "Sure," she said at last, trying to sound nonchalant. "Why not?" They exchanged numbers, and Lydia drove home in a daze. That evening, as she sipped her tea, she reread his text confirming their coffee date. She told herself it was innocent, a chance to share her love of cooking and help someone else find joy in it. But as she looked at her reflection in the darkened window, she couldn't ignore the small thrill that had taken root within her. For the first time in years, something, or rather someone, had shifted the rhythm of her quiet life. Their coffee meeting happened on a crisp Saturday morning, the air carrying the faint scent of autumn. Lydia arrived early, settling into a corner table at a cozy cafe she hadn't visited in years. The place buzzed with conversation, but she focused on the menu, nervously adjusting the scarf draped over her shoulders. When Ben walked in, his easy smile and casual wave instantly put her at ease. He carried 2 cups of coffee, one for her, already sweetened with cream as he'd guessed from their conversation. "Thought I'd save you the trip to the counter," he said, sliding the cup toward her. They talked effortlessly, the conversation flowing from cooking mishaps to their favorite books and movies. Ben spoke with an energy that felt refreshing to Lydia, his stories punctuated with laughter that made her forget the years between them. "I've always thought cooking was like storytelling," he said, leaning forward. You take different ingredients, some sweet, some bitter, and find a way to make them work together. Kind of like life, don't you think? Lydia smiled, taken aback by his thoughtfulness. That's a beautiful way of putting it. I've always felt that recipes were a way of connecting, like a thread tying us to the people we share them with. Their coffee stretched into an hour then, too. When Ben finally checked his watch, he groaned. I didn't mean to keep you this long. You probably have plans. She shook her head, laughing. No, this has been lovely. I can't remember the last time I talked like this. As they walked out together, Ben stopped at the door. So how about a cooking lesson next time? I promise I'll bring the wine if you can handle the teaching. It was a playful suggestion, but Lydia felt the weight of it. Spending more time with him felt both thrilling and precarious, like stepping onto unfamiliar terrain. I'll think about it, she said with a smile, her heart fluttering as he grinned. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became regular. A shared lunch here, a trip to the farmer's market there. Lydia found herself looking forward to his messages, her days brightened by his wit and warmth. She was cautious, though, mindful of how easily their connection could be misread. To others, they were simply an unlikely pair. She, a reserved woman in her 50s, and he, a vibrant man barely in his 30s. But to Lydia, their time together was a rediscovery of joy, a reminder of the vitality she thought she'd lost. One evening, after a particularly lively phone conversation about holiday recipes, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her laughter still echoed in her mind, and for the first time in years, the quiet loneliness of her room didn't feel suffocating. But as her heart danced in the glow of their budding friendship, a small voice inside reminded her that this could never be more than what it was. Could it? The realization crept up on her slowly, like the changing of seasons, a subtle shift she couldn't quite place until it was undeniable. One evening, after another impromptu trip to the grocery store with Ben, Lydia found herself lingering by her kitchen window. She watched the soft glow of the streetlights, her mind replaying their easy banter and his warm smile as he insisted on carrying her bags. She told herself it was simple gratitude for his kindness, an appreciation for the companionship that had unexpectedly brightened her days. But as she stood there, clutching a mug of tea that had long since cooled, she couldn't ignore the warmth that spread through her chest whenever he was near. It wasn't just gratitude. The moment of clarity came during one of their outings, a chilly afternoon at the farmer's market. They had been walking side by side, weaving through stalls lined with vibrant autumn produce. Ben had picked up an apple and held it out to her with a playful grin. Sweet or tart? He asked. She had laughed, taking the apple and holding his gaze for just a moment too long. There was something in his eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or a flicker of something she dared not name. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly looked away, pretending to study the apple in her hand. That night, she lay awake in bed, her thoughts tangled in confusion and longing. How had she let this happen? At 52, she had resigned herself to the quiet life she had built, free of complications or risks. Falling for someone, especially someone younger, had never crossed her mind. It wasn't just the age difference that unsettled her. It was the vulnerability of it all, the fear of opening herself up to feelings she wasn't sure she could handle. She tried to rationalize it away, reminding herself of the absurdity of it. Ben was kind, yes. Thoughtful and engaging, certainly. But he was young, full of life and possibilities she couldn't compete with. Yet, the heart has a way of defying logic. The next time they met, Lydia felt herself hyper-aware of every glance, every touch. When Ben casually placed a hand on her arm while pointing out something in a shop window, her skin tingled in a way that startled her. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing her uncharacteristic quietness. "Of course," she said quickly, forcing a smile. But inside a storm raged. She was torn between the thrill of her growing feelings and the shame that accompanied them. What would he think if he knew? Would he laugh? Or worse, would he pity her? She began to avoid looking too long into his eyes, terrified he might see the truth written all over her face. Yet every time they parted ways, she found herself counting the hours until their next meeting. Her heart, once so carefully guarded, had betrayed her. And now, there was no turning back. Lydia paced her living room, the soft hum of the radio filling the otherwise quiet space. The idea had been circling her mind for days, whispering insistently despite her attempts to dismiss it. She stopped by the window, absently smoothing her hands over the sleeves of her cardigan. The autumn leaves scattered on the pavement mirrored her swirling thoughts, beautiful but chaotic. Inviting Ben over felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she was ready to navigate. What reason could she give? They had shared countless chats over coffee and walked through the market together, but stepping into her home felt different. It was intimate, vulnerable. Her hand rested on the back of the sofa as she rehearsed possible excuses. A recommendation for the film he had mentioned last week? Sharing the vintage record player she had once proudly restored? No, too obvious. Too contrived. Her heart thudded in her chest as she settled on a plan. Ben had a natural curiosity about art, often pausing to admire pieces displayed in the windows of galleries during their walks. Lydia had a modest collection herself. Watercolors, sketches, a few oil paintings she'd collected over the years. That would be her reason. The next time they met, Lydia waited until the conversation veered toward his interest in painting. They were standing by a row of tall sycamores in the park, their leaves casting golden patches of light on the path. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "I have some pieces at home you might like," she said, glancing at him with a practiced casualness. "I could show them to you sometime." Ben's face lit up. "I'd love that," he said with unrestrained enthusiasm. "When's a good time?" Lydia's stomach flipped. His response had been so immediate, so genuine, that she felt a pang of guilt for her carefully constructed invitation. "Tomorrow, maybe," she replied, trying not to sound too eager. The next day, as the hour of his arrival approached, Lydia busied herself with preparations. She fluffed cushions, arranged the painting she planned to show, and even baked a loaf of her mother's apple bread. A detail that, she scolded herself, was entirely unnecessary but oddly comforting. When the knock came, she hesitated for a heartbeat before opening the door. Ben stood there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I thought these might brighten your collection," he said with an easy grin. Her throat tightened as she accepted the flowers, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting moment. "They're beautiful," she murmured, stepping aside to let him in. As he moved through her home, complimenting the art and asking questions with genuine interest, Lydia felt her apprehension slowly give way to something softer. He treated her space, and by extension her, with a respect and curiosity that warmed her heart. When they settled in the living room, their conversation shifted from art to stories of their lives. He listened intently as she spoke about her childhood, her first trip to Paris, and the years she spent raising her daughter. "You've lived such a full life," Ben said, his voice tinged with admiration. She smiled, though a flicker of sadness passed through her. "Full? Yes," she said, "but there's always room for more." As they sat there, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them, Lydia realized how right it felt to share the space with him. The lines she had drawn in her mind, age, propriety, fear, blurred in the light of his presence. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. The evening had settled into a comfortable silence, save for the soft tick of the old clock on the mantelpiece. Lydia hadn't expected her heart to race like this, not after all these years. She had prepared for awkwardness, for the uncertain space that often filled the room when someone new entered her world. But instead, it was as though they had always known each other, like the air between them had always hummed with this quiet connection. Ben leaned forward slightly, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the coffee table, as if he were deliberating on his next words. He had a way of being fully present, of listening not just with his ears but with his entire being. It was a rare quality. "I don't know if I've ever told you this," he began, his voice quieter now, "but when I first met you in the store, I couldn't help but notice the way you carried yourself. You didn't rush, didn't seem frazzled like everyone else. It felt like you had a peace." Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea how to respond. The idea that someone, especially someone so much younger, would notice something like that, let alone appreciate it, left her speechless. It wasn't just her appearance or the way she looked, but something deeper. He had seen her in a way that few did, not just as a woman in her 50s, not just as someone who had lived through the mundane grind of life, but as someone with presence. She met his gaze, and in that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them. The walls she had so carefully built around herself, those walls of caution and self-doubt, began to crack. She had never been one to embrace vulnerability easily, but something in the way Ben was looking at her made it feel safe. There was a shift in the atmosphere. The sound of the ticking clock seemed to soften, and everything around them faded into a blur. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest, and the world outside felt distant. It was just the two of them now, standing in this quiet space, and she realized she was no longer trying to convince herself that it was all a passing fancy. He stood up, slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked toward the window. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt loaded with meaning. She watched him, unable to tear her eyes away. Then, without warning, he turned back to her, his expression open and sincere. "You know, Lydia," he said, his voice soft yet steady, "I didn't expect any of this. But I find myself wanting to spend more time with you. There's something about you that makes everything else feel less important. I don't know what that means, but it's true." Her heart fluttered in her chest. The words were like a quiet confession, and they reached places in her she had long since sealed off. She didn't know how to respond, but her instinct was simple. She reached out just slightly, her fingers grazing the back of his hand. Ben turned to her with a faint, questioning smile. "Does this feel strange to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had allowed herself to put the question into words. "No," he answered, his voice steady and sure. "It doesn't feel strange. It feels real." In that moment, all the uncertainty about their age gap, all the self-consciousness about what others might think, those things seemed so small, so irrelevant. What mattered was the connection between them, the bond that had grown unexpectedly but undeniably. He hadn't seen her age. He had seen her. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held 1,000 unspoken words, words that didn't need to be said. She could feel his warmth, the magnetic pull between them, and her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She stood up, her movements almost instinctive now, and before she knew it, they were standing closer, their hands brushing, their faces only inches apart. She could see the depth in his eyes, the quiet strength that came from someone who didn't question the path he was walking. He didn't see her age. He saw the person she was. And in that moment, Lydia realized she had started to see herself through his eyes too. As their faces drew nearer, she could feel the tension building between them, electric and palpable. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, and without thinking, she leaned in, the briefest of moments before her lips met his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though they were both testing the waters. But when it deepened, when the connection between them ignited, Lydia couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in years, she was truly alive. And in that quiet space, surrounded by the art she had collected over the years, Lydia realized that love, true love, had never been bound by time. Lydia sat back against the couch, her fingers lightly touching her lips, still tingling from the kiss. The room felt different now, somehow warmer, more alive. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The past hours had unlocked something within her, something she had long buried under layers of fear and self-doubt. But now, with the warmth of Ben's touch still lingering in her veins, she couldn't deny the truth that had emerged so unexpectedly. She had always told herself that love belonged to the young, to the ones who hadn't yet felt the weight of years on their shoulders. She had convinced herself that at her age, she should settle for quiet solitude, that the romance and passion she had once known were far behind her, tucked away in a memory that had faded with time. But now, sitting here, her thoughts were different. The heart, it seemed, had no expiry date. It didn't stop beating just because the years piled up. It didn't forget how to love, how to yearn. Her fingers traced the lines on the back of her hand, the small wrinkles that spoke of years lived and stories etched into the skin. For so long, she had hidden these marks, embarrassed by them, as if they were proof of her limitations. But now, with Ben's gaze still etched in her mind, those lines felt like the map of her life, a life that had led her here, to this very moment to him. She thought about the years she had spent alone, telling herself that she had everything she needed within her, that self-sufficiency was all she could rely on. But now, after tonight, she saw things differently. Love, in its truest form, wasn't just about needing someone. It was about connection, about sharing the quiet moments and the loud ones, about opening up the doors that had been locked for so long and allowing someone in. Ben hadn't tried to fix her. He hadn't tried to rescue her from the past. He had simply seen her for who she was, and that was enough. What was it that had brought them together? She couldn't explain it. There was no formula to this kind of love, no set of rules that made sense of it. It wasn't just about physical attraction. Though that was undeniably there, it was more. It was about a meeting of souls. It was about the way he listened to her, the way he looked at her as if every word she said mattered. In his eyes, she wasn't a woman past her prime, not a woman stuck in a past she couldn't let go of. She was someone worth paying attention to, someone with depth and stories to tell. But there was also fear. Fear of judgment, of the inevitable whispers that would come from society, from those who wouldn't understand. Age had a way of coloring perceptions, of making people think that certain things were off limits, that love belonged to the young. Lydia had heard the whispers before. She had seen the looks, the ones that lingered just a moment too long when a woman her age walked down the street with someone significantly younger. But tonight, in the warmth of Ben's embrace, she had realized something crucial. Those judgments didn't matter. The world could think what it wanted. It could offer its opinions, its concerns, its assumptions about what was appropriate or not. But love, real love, didn't bow to age. It didn't bend to social expectations. It simply existed. And it was up to those who felt it to embrace it, no matter how unconventional or unlikely it seemed. Lydia looked out the window at the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the trees. The world was the same, but she wasn't. She felt lighter now, as if the weight of the years had suddenly become something that no longer defined her. She was not just a woman in her 50s. She was a woman who still had the capacity to feel joy, desire, and the kind of love that made the heart race and the mind forget everything else. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself remember the way Ben's lips had felt against hers, the way his touch had ignited something deep inside her. This wasn't about being reckless or throwing caution to the wind. This was about living fully, about experiencing something that was as beautiful and unexpected as life itself. She wasn't ready to walk away from this just because it defied logic. There was something real here, something worth exploring. She didn't need to answer all the questions now. She didn't need to figure out how everything would fit together, how their worlds would align. All she needed to do was allow herself to feel, to embrace the joy of this moment, this connection, and see where it led. After all, love wasn't something to be understood. It was something to be lived. And in that moment, Lydia made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let fear or doubt stand in the way of what her heart had already decided. Age was nothing but a number, a construct of society. But love, true love, was ageless. It had no expiration date. It was something that could bloom at any stage in life, and for the first time in years, Lydia allowed herself to believe it. There was no looking back now. As the days passed, Lydia's heart beat a little faster, and her steps felt lighter. The world outside seemed brighter, more alive. The simple, quiet existence she had once accepted as her reality was now filled with possibilities. Ben had left an imprint on her, not just in the way he made her feel cherished and desired, but in how he had opened her eyes to a new world, a world where love didn't follow the rules set by others. It was limitless, unbound by age or time. She didn't know where this would go, this unexpected bond. Maybe it would turn into something lasting, or maybe it would fade with time, like so many fleeting moments in life. But Lydia no longer feared the unknown. She was no longer concerned with the outcome, only with the present. The way his presence made her smile, the way their conversations felt like shared secrets, the way his touch ignited something long dormant inside her. In the mornings, she found herself thinking of him, the way he had taken her hand, the tenderness with which he held her. At night, as she lay in bed, her thoughts drifted to their quiet exchanges, their laughter, the warmth of his embrace. It was more than physical, it was a soul-deep connection, an unexpected gift. She had not sought it out, but it had arrived, like the soft glow of a sunrise after a long night. Lydia had learned something profound from this experience, that love in all its forms was a gift to be embraced. There was no expiration date, no right time for it. It could arrive when you least expected it, in the most unlikely of places, like a grocery store aisle or a chance encounter with someone who saw you not for your age, but for the person you were. A person with dreams, with a history, with passion still burning, no matter how many years had passed. She thought about the women she knew, the ones who had resigned themselves to the idea that romance belonged to the young. How many of them had closed their hearts off, telling themselves that love wasn't for them anymore. She wanted to say something to them, to remind them that it wasn't over, that there was still so much to be experienced, so much to be felt. It wasn't about looking backward and regretting lost time. It was about moving forward, opening up to the possibilities. So Lydia had decided, not with haste, but with quiet certainty, that she would continue this journey with Ben, wherever it may lead. She would let the world talk if it wanted to, but she wouldn't let that stop her from exploring what felt right for her. Age didn't have to define her. Her desires didn't have to fit into anyone's box. She was free to follow her heart, and that was the most liberating feeling of all. At the end of the day, Lydia knew this. Love had no limits, no restrictions. It was a force that existed beyond time and age, waiting to be embraced. And as she thought about the future, she didn't feel fear or hesitation. She felt hope, she felt alive, and that, more than anything, was what she needed. With Ben, she was rediscovering the beauty of living fully. She was shedding the skin of her past self and becoming someone who believed, with every fiber of her being, that love was ageless, that it could bloom like a flower at any stage of life, and that, no matter what happened next, she had given herself the freedom to love again. And for now, that was enough.